It can't be the end of the story because right now the country has no policy on asylum seekers. Our studio guest this morning is the Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. But first we'll see what the Sunday papers are reporting, and of course the second big dominant issue in federal politics, Carbon Tax Sunday. Fran Kelly, how's the treatment of that story in the papers this morning?
Well, it will wallop your wallet, is what one News Limited paper is saying, and then the story itself doesn't actually say how that will happen, but that's basically the line from the Coalition. Tony Abbott is quoting as saying, "From tomorrow, every problem we face will get worse," which of course is an exaggeration because it's not going to, I don't think, affect, whether you can get in to see the doctor or whether, getting to work is any quicker or slower in the mornings, or all those sorts of many problems we can think of are not going to be touched by the carbon price. But that's the sort of rhetoric we're going to hear from today. The government's message, I think, is it's not going to get worse, but it's going to take a few months for that to play out. Though the government is heartened by the fact that people seem to be registering the fact they're getting the money in their bank accounts now. Whether that'll make them change their mind on the carbon tax is something else. So no new messages. Really, the Coalition's message is this is all awful, it's going to be terrible, the pain is going to be there for no gain. The government's saying it's not going to be that painful because we're compensating you, just relax, and it's the only way to get something done on climate change. Sadly, the government is giving that message against a great drop in the polls in terms of the general community's preparedness to take any pain on action on climate change.
And the opposition are running some ads. They've started up in the newspapers. There's a television ad pretty much ready to go. The problem, I guess, with the coverage today is that there's nothing to see. How do you illustrate a story like this? It's supposed to be a big day in Australian politics, but how do you demonstrate it?
It's a dramatic day of nothing happening, in short. I mean, and a lot of people won't get their... the people who have to pay the carbon price won't get their bills until next July. So in fact, you could argue that it won't be until 2015 before we know what level of success or failure the scheme has had, and that's when the Productivity Commission is set to review its operation. But in the meantime, it's all that's left are the politics, and the politics are the opposition saying, repeating, Julia Gillard said she wouldn't do this, and she has. And the government saying, well, there are a lot of benefits out there for people who pay tax and people who don't pay tax. Tony Abbott is going to take them all off you, whether or not he can roll back the carbon pricing scheme. Yeah,
that's where the argument goes next. Except for the 11 people who might be checking into the Town and Country Hotel in Petersham in Sydney, they're going to see their room rate go up 10-20% apparently because of the carbon tax. So I think there will be a few of those things around that will make stories along the way over the next week or two.
But I think also the contest for the next few months is actually going to be whether the government can swing it around from a referendum on a broken promise to an issue about it's not that bad. So you've got the contest between a monster that hasn't arrived and the sleeping giant that Tony Abbott says will come.
Well, I think, as Malcolm said, the government's challenge will be to try and switch the pressure back onto Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey now to say, OK, you're going to repeal it. What are you going to do with all the payments people have got, the tax cuts they've got, the changes to the tax system, the increased pensioners? How are you going to do that? How are you going to pay for that?
Well,
so far, Tony Abbott hasn't had to answer that.
He has in part. What he said is that he'll introduce the tax cuts anyway. People will get their tax cuts.
Some tax cuts.
Some tax cuts, but they'll be paid for with spending cuts. That doesn't explain, for example, pensions.
No, people who don't pay tax, are they going to lose what they're getting from this government? There's a further point that I'm sure the government will press home more strongly, and that is, what would an Abbott government do about price increases? You cannot tell me that if prices do go up because of carbon pricing, that the elimination of the carbon pricing scheme would automatically see those prices come down again. That is, that the CPI would be reduced
but
immediately.
Will have to. If they're not getting their compensation, prices will have to come down.
Tell me how often prices come down for any reason.
Tony Abbott's being very bullish too over the weekend at the Liberal Party Council about this. For instance, saying that the day one of an election campaign, he will write to Prime Minister and Cabinet and remind them that if he wins, he will be take the carbon price off from day one. Also insisting that the Clean Energy Finance Corporation stop handing out any grants to businesses that are involved in the clean energy that might be eligible. I don't actually think he has the power to do that second one, as far as I can tell.
I think that what would happen is that automatically the Finance Corporation couldn't, contract any big couldn't have any big contracts because that's the nature of the conventions.
No, I don't think that that's true, is it? It'll be an independent statutory authority or something, wouldn't it be able to work?
Well, that's possibly the case, but I know we're going to talk about asylum seekers at some point. I mean, like the deal with Nauru, for example, was done at 11:55 a.m. on a certain day just before the conventions came in. So there's going to be a certain amount that cannot be done by reference to the conventions. So I think that this is, it's a bit of a furphy, but he wants to be seen as being able to do something and be doing something.
I think more than that, I think he wants to give a big loud signal to business in this country not to go too far down the, putting in place things to adjust the carbon tax because it's not going to be there and he doesn't want to have to pay the compensation.
There's a lot of discussion about that and about compensation, but there's not much discussion about why we're having a carbon tax at all.
Exactly. The environment... Look,
hasn't been for a long time.
There are three issues here: the economic impact, or lack of it, of carbon pricing, the political debate, who do you trust on this? And we're seeing... The opposition say, well, you can't trust the Prime Minister and the Treasurer because they said there would not be a carbon tax. The government saying, well, you can't trust the opposition because Mr Abbott said the world would roughly end, give or take a minute or two after midnight. But the big one is the environmental debate. Why? That's why we're doing this. Yeah. Will it be effective? Do we think it's necessary? That's disappeared.
To some extent, it seems... I don't know if it's the carbon tax debate. Something is already having some impact because apparently... what we heard last week on breakfast from the head of AGL is that power demand has dropped. It dropped under the global financial crisis because of the less intensive business activity, and it's kept dropping because manufacturing has dropped, but it's also dropped significantly because of the take-up of solar PV panels, domestic use, and also we're getting more energy efficient.
People are changing their habits at home. And just this morning, watching some breakfast television, they're actually talking about this kind of stuff now, what people can do to save power. So I guess
so people are getting ready for the carbon tax by trying to cut back their energy usage.
Now, Tony Abbott famously said that Whyalla would be wiped off the map come July 1. Gary Gray, whose mother, he's in Perth, but his mother lives in Whyalla, so he went to Whyalla this morning to be with her, and he sent us this little family video.
So, Mum, that terrible Tony Abbott says Whyalla will be wiped off the face of the earth by the carbon price. What do you think?
I think that's a load of bunk and what we'll look. Anyway, if it does happen, we've got our ark to sail away on.
See, it's a difficult story to illustrate. So anybody who comes up with some little stunt like that, I mean, they're guaranteed to get a run.
We could have competing mums soon.
I think there are real fears. I think small business people particularly are really fearful because they're not getting compensated. They're not the ones getting the free carbon permits or the $1 million or anything like that. So I think there is still some concern.
OK, well, that's the Sunday Papers. The Prime Minister is next here in the studio. And while she joins us, here's the opposition leader, Tony Abbott, addressing yesterday's Liberal Party conference on the eve of July 1.